Oh, Charlie had a story.
Welcome back to the Munn Avenue Muse, where we explore the stories behind the stories and the writers who bring them to life. And we are brought to you today by the Munn, M-U-N-N, AvenuePress.com. I'm your host, Charlie Levin, and today's guest is Robert Merrick Fuller, author of the recently published and beautifully evocative memoir, A Horsedrawn Sicklebar Cutter. And you might ask, what's a sicklebar cutter? But Robert will explain. This isn't just a personal memoir. It's a living capsule of rural America, family farming, and a boyhood shaped by both tradition and change. Robert takes us from the fields of Ludlow, Massachusetts, to the windswept beaches of Cape Cod, all while giving us an insider's look at a world that's largely vanished, but not forgotten. Today, we'll talk about what it means to preserve memory on the page, the challenges of writing honestly about family, and how sound, smell, and place can shape a lifetime and a narrative. Whether you're writing your own memoir, researching your roots, or just love a well-told story, this is an episode you won't want to miss. Welcome, Robert.
Hello, Charlie.
So nice to have you here, and it was so great working with you on your wonderful book.
Yes, thank you. I agree. I feel the same about you. It's been a wonderful experience.
Yeah. So let's get into it. Your memoir paints a vivid picture of rural life, particularly through sensory memories, like the sound of the sickle bar cutter. Can you tell us why that specific sound stayed with you and how it came to represent a larger theme in your book?
So this is my book cover, and this is a painting that I own. It was done here in Vermont, down in Woodstock, and it's two draft horses with a sickle bar. You can barely see up there. And the reason I chose that image and that title is because in the small farming neighborhood where I grew up in Ludlow, Massachusetts, there was a Polish couple across the street in the 50s who were still doing their farming with two horses in their hands. A type of farming that was fading quickly, and except for some Amish communities, is all but gone now. So I cherish those memories because they were fading then, and it wasn't a few years, certainly by the 60s, that you didn't see people around my neighborhood with draft horses doing their regular farming work. So, it's kind of a memory from the past. And the sound of a horse-drawn sicklebar cutter is an oscillation because of the way the horses move, they lunge forward with each step. And so the sicklebar cutter doesn't, if you drag one with a tractor, it just is a steady hum. But if you drag one with a couple of draft horses, it's an oscillation. So, that's a unique sound from my childhood that stuck with me all these years. And that's why I chose that title and that particular painting. I bought the painting because it reminded me of my childhood over 30 years ago. And it hangs in my living room in Lincoln, Vermont.
Well, the rhythm of that sound is probably another reason it sticks with you, is the oscillation somehow resonates because our hearts beat in an oscillation and we breathe in an oscillation, and it makes sense. You skillfully balanced both the personal memories and the historical context. I mean, starting with the Mayflower and going all the way to World War II. And you have an interest in that whole span of time. So was this sort of dual approach intentional, or did it just sort of happen as you wrote the book?
Well, I grew up in a 150-year-old farmhouse. My grandfather, Warren Meacham Fuller, was the fourth generation. My father, Douglas Warren Fuller, was the fifth, and I was the sixth generation with my brother. And,
And the
They
first
settled.
the first generation was the Mayflower generation,
Yeah. So the
correct?
first generation,
Right.
yeah, there's a book called The History of Ludlow that was published in 1913 that has a lot of family genealogy from families in Ludlow, one of them, the Fuller family. And that's how I found out that Edward Fuller was the founder of the Fuller family in Ludlow, Massachusetts. And he was baptized in Redenhall, England in 1575. In 1610, he became one of the pilgrims, later known as pilgrims. They called them at the time separatists, who left England and moved to the Netherlands to escape religious persecution. And then 10 years later, in 1620, they decided if they stayed in the Netherlands, they were going to become Dutch, and they didn't want to lose their identity. So they decided to get on the Mayflower and sail to the Promised Land. And so there are now 35 million Americans who can trace their ancestry directly to this small group of pilgrims who came over to the U.S. in 1620. But there's only 41 signers of the Mayflower Compact, and Edward Fuller was one of those signers.
Yeah. Very
So
interesting.
I find
And
that interesting. And he and his wife died the first year, but their son Samuel lived, and eventually the family moved, or some members of the family moved to Connecticut, Ellington, Connecticut. And then sometime in the mid 1700s, a group of them, or one of them, moved to Ludlow. So I grew up at 333 Fuller Street in Ludlow, Massachusetts. I didn't know any of this history when I was a child. And I wish I'd asked my grandfather more, because I don't know if he inherited the farm or if he bought the farm, or who owned it before him or after him. I've asked many of my cousins, and they don't know either.
yeah, no,
So,
it's interesting. It's a reason to write memoirs too, because you provide a historical record. I've said this before, but I wish my grandfathers wrote something about their lives or the family, because I can't trace it back more than two generations. So, and I think most of us want to know what our roots are and what our connections are, and you explore that so well. So part of it is two errors. One is this 19th century farm life, and then the other is sort of the modernizing world. What what do you think uh, readers can learn from your experience and the transition that you went through from little farm boy to modern motorcycle madman?
well, my subtitle is Finding My Road to Felicity, which it means extreme happiness or bliss. And it's a word that I stumbled on 2 or 3 years ago. It's a common woman's name. And then it also means, extreme happiness. And so I had many failures. I'm not going to go into them all, but in my early life, and especially scholastically, I finally woke up the second or third year in high school, and started to do better. And little by little, was able to create a very comfortable life for myself.
Well,
So
you were in the restaurant business too.
I
Why don't you
was,
tell
yeah.
us a little bit about that?
So I knew from the age of 9, when we were delivering milk door to door in glass bottles for 23 cents a quart, that there was no future for me in that business. That was a business model that was fading fast. And, by the early 60s, home delivery of milk was almost disappeared, because supermarkets were being built and people were buying their milk in supermarkets in gallon jugs. They didn't need home delivery anymore. So I needed a career, and the thing that came across my bow that appealed to me was a career in cooking, because I had some early success working with my mother at her elbow with Duncan Hines cake mixes. And I enjoyed making cakes and decorating, and of course, I enjoyed eating them. So that's what got me interested in cooking. And then I read an article about the life in the culinary field, and I found out about the Culinary Institute of America, which at that time was in New Haven, Connecticut, started by two women the year I was born, 1946. specifically to take advantage of the GI Bill, because they knew that all the veterans that were coming back from the Second World War were not going to go to college. So why not start a school for cooks? And by the time I went there in 1969 to 71, they had moved up to the top of Prospect Hill, and they bought some old mansions and repurposed them into what they called practical kitchens and classrooms. And it was a 2-year program, and most of the instructors were European, either Swiss or French, some Italian. And so I knew very little about international food. So I was fascinated by the whole experience, and learning about food. And what I like most about cooking is the opportunity to take some raw ingredients, manipulate them properly, and create something that wasn't there before. My favorite example of a very simple food is bread. You take 3 ingredients or 4 ingredients, sugar, flour, and salt and yeast, and you manipulate them properly, and you create a food that wasn't there before. And if you don't manipulate them properly, you make something that looks more like a doorstop, which is what happens if you kill the yeast because the water you were trying to propagate it in gets too hot. So these are some of the kind of things I learned when I was in culinary school, that the yeast that you're putting in bread dies at 138 degrees. So, and a lot of the yeast that I used later in life was dry yeast. So you had to activate it in warm water, usually with a spoon of sugar, and till it foamed up, and then add it to the bread and stuff. So I also found out that the hottest temperature that the human hand can stand for any extended period is about 125 degrees. So if you put your hand in a bucket of water and you can stand it, then you can put the yeast in there and you're not going to kill it. And those are some of the kind of basic things that I learned just getting started. And I really enjoyed the process of creation.
Very interesting. Memoir, writing a memoir like you did can be cathartic, but also an emotional challenge. There are parts of your story, like your father's struggles or the bedwetting episode, that were hard to share. How did you decide what to include and what to leave out?
Well, it was a 3-year process writing this memoir. And so there were some things that were originally included that were left out. And then there were some things that were added in. Some I still have some reservations about, why did I see this or why did I see that? But I talked to somebody recently who had read my memoir, and I said, "What did you think of it?" He said, "It was very revealing." I didn't know quite what he meant by that, but there's some pretty personal adult stuff in there, just small snippets of it. I didn't want to overdo it with that subject, but I was trying to write an interesting story, a story that I might like to read myself, and tell the truth about my life as much as I wanted to. Certainly, there's lots of things I left out for just because I didn't want to be boring or because I didn't want it to be too personal. But I have a quote here from Barbara Kingsolver. It says, "Close the door and write as if no one were looking over your shoulder. Don't try to figure out what other people want to hear from you. Figure out what you want to say. That's the one and only thing you have to offer." And I think that's a great quote, for anyone who, you say what you want to say. And thankfully, my wife, who's a very good critic, did not read my memoir until it was written. And if she had read it, I'm sure I would have done a lot more editing, just based on her opinions. After she did read it, she told me that she enjoyed it very much. And she thought she enjoyed it because it was honest, because it was straightforward. And so everyone has to decide themselves what it is they want to say, and then figure out how to get the story across in an entertaining, hopefully, way.
And what? I think part of what makes your memoir so engaging is because it's very personal, and it is revealing. People can tell when they're reading, a story that's fluff or is really coming from the heart. And your book is absolutely coming from the heart. So if many of our listeners are authors and some are working on their own memoirs and family histories. We've probably got three or four now that we are working on publishing. What advice would you offer someone just beginning to write about their life or their ancestors?
Read a lot. That's the one thing you can do. I read several memoirs. Some of them I wasn't that impressed with, and others I was very impressed with. And I would have to say the one that influenced me the most, and not completely, but it's a story similar to mine. It's called How to Say Babylon by a Jamaican woman named Sophia Sinclair. And she grew up in Montego Bay in a very poor Rastafarian family. Her father was a musician and he was a rabid Rastafarian. I didn't find out till I read her memoir that only about 5% of Jamaicans are Rastafarian. I thought they must all be Rastafarian, because of people like Bob Marley. And he played at different resorts around Montego Bay. And between songs, he would give a little diatribe about Rastafarian beliefs. And then he'd get fired, and then the family would have to move to a smaller house. So she rejected Rastafarianism eventually. And she also studied poetry with someone she identifies only as the old poet. And she read the Encyclopedia Britannica for fun when she was a child. And she eventually went to Bennington College in southern Vermont, very exclusive, expensive college, and graduated from there. Then she went to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville and got an MFA in creative writing. And I believe she went to UCLA and got a doctorate, and she may teach there. I haven't followed her career that closely, but I saw the book, and the thing I like about the book is somewhat like me, she started from very humble beginnings, and through grit and determination, and realizing that she wanted to make a better life for herself, she worked hard at educating herself by reading and studying, and so I can't say that my memoirs will be as highly credited as hers. She's also very beautiful. And if you go online and look her up, she's done some modeling in the past. I don't know if she still does that or not, but um, so that was my one of my big inspirations. And that's why there's 5 poems in my memoir. There's one poem in her memoir called Silver, something about silver running in my blood. And because of her and because of Jay Perini, who's a professor at Middlebury College, who's written several books about poetry, written a biography of Robert Frost. I've read a lot of poetry since high school, but there's a lot of poetry I don't understand, and I still don't understand it. One of the poems that Sophia Sinclair was introduced to by the old poet, a poem called "The Idea of Order in Key West." The author was Wallace Stevens. He was an insurance executive in Hartford, Connecticut, and I never heard of him before I read her memoir. And I've read that poem a dozen times. I challenge you to read it.
Well,
The idea,
it's interesting, Robert, how one of the things that you're leading us to is that besides a memoir, besides documenting a person's life or the history during their lifetime, can also be really inspiring. It inspired you to write, inspired you to check out these other authors. And it's interesting because I read a book by Jay Perini called Borges and Me, which is terrific because I'm a big fan of that author, Jorge, George Luis Borges, who writes kind of um, neo-realistic, very interesting, complex stories. And he landed up as a grad student in England, and Perini did, and kind of accidentally met Borges and landed up driving him across country And it's so well written and so well told. And you made me also, while you were talking about it, think of if I had to, if somebody asked me what's your favorite memoir biography that you ever read, I would tell you it was Charlie Chaplin's biography is
Uh,
quite fantastic and got me very interested in silent film, and I studied more and looked at more as a result. So the other thing that interests me about your example too is her story is inspirational, and she does come from um, a humble background, but she's super different than you are. So, as authors and readers, we have to be open to a wide variety of stories. And I know what an avid reader you are because every time I talk to you, you were reading a different book and
yeah,
asking me about certain books. And
yeah,
certainly for writers, that's a must. But Robert, when we met, you shared with me that you had stage 4 cancer. And that
that's
was
true.
part of your motivation for writing this book. And we kind of did it in a hurry because we wanted to make sure the book came out in time.
Yeah.
Do you want to share anything about that, or would you rather
Well,
not?
you could say it was a motivator because for many years now, I've been telling people that Scott Nearing is my role model for dying, and he and his wife wrote a book called "Living the Good Life," and and I know a friend of mine here in Vermont who lived with them for 3 or 4 years, and she said, "Oh, Scott always said, if I live to be 100, that's it. I'm going to throw in the towel." And he lived to be 100, and he stopped eating. And so, that can happen at any age. My father-in-law did it. My wife's father did it at about 88. And so it's a balance of quality of life and what you're willing to put up with. So yeah, certainly, you know, my oncologist has been very clear. When I've told him that I had this dream to live another 20 years, that I shouldn't hold on to that dream too tight. So it's I know at some point in the future, I don't know when, the quality of my life will deteriorate to the point where I'll just say, you know what, I'm done. I'm not going to eat anymore. I'm ready to let go. And I've already, I'm making a lot of plans for that. Besides writing a book, I've written my own obituary because I went to my brother's funeral a year ago, and the obituary I think was written by the funeral home, and I just thought, it's all boilerplate. It's terrible. And so I wrote my own obituary. I've also made my own coffin. I'm going to do what's called a green burial, where you're just buried 3 feet under so that the roots from plants and things can get to your deteriorating corpse and actually use some of the nutrients to help themselves grow. And I know where I'm going to be buried because it's going to be up in a farm in Lincoln. So, I'm planning for all this stuff because that's the kind of guy I like to be. I don't want to leave it all to somebody else to decide what to do. I'm also making up a song list. I haven't gotten very far in that yet, of favorite songs that I would like people to listen to at my memorial service, which is what I sort of planning. I've been to a few of those recently. The burials are usually quite small and private, just a dozen or so family members, but then there's a memorial afterwards. And I went to one memorial here in Lincoln, and there's a local man named Jeremy Perfect who has a big barrel chest and a beautiful baritone voice. And I didn't realize that the poem "Crossing the Bar" um, had been set to music, and he sang it a cappella, and it was absolutely beautiful. And after he got done, and I talked to him later, I said, "I really loved your rendition there. And if you're still around when I'm gone, I want you to sing that at my memorial service." So everybody wants to be remembered in some way, and so having a printed memoir like I've produced here, will produce some kind of a legacy. I think I've already told you I don't plan on having a headstone, but I've made 2 memorial benches, one made out of slate and stainless steel legs, and the other one made out of black locust, which is the most rot resistant wood that grows in Vermont. And I expect these benches to be moved around after I'm gone. But, told my stepson, one's up on his farm, said, if you get tired of looking at it, I said, just take it out in the field somewhere, but once in a while when you walk by there, you go, oh yeah, there's Robert's bench, and so there'll be a little memory of me there, hopefully a good memory, so I guess that's part of the memoir process, and it sounds a little egotistical to say it, but what the hell, I've read a lot of memoirs, as I said, and I thought, well, I'll write my own. I have a story to tell. The story is, I came from a very humble beginnings. I had lots of failures early in my life, and probably because I was born in America, because my wife and I traveled to Ghana, West Africa in 1997. I'd never been to a developing country before, and I write about that in a memoir. And besides marrying my wife, it was the single most life-changing event that I ever did. I went again in 99, and we still have students there that we're helping with their tuitions and stuff because, a lot of this country still to this day is in the rural areas. They don't have electricity. They don't have running water, and education is difficult to come by.
Yeah.
Even though the tuition is free, if you live in a rural area, you have to go to a regional high school and you have to pay room and board. Now, when I was there in 97, I don't know what it is now, room and board at the regional high school, which was some distance away, was $350 a year, which doesn't sound like a lot of money in the US of A, but that could be the family per capita income on a rural farm that's growing nothing but cassava and trying to sell it in the market with a lot of other people who are growing cassava. So we have actually paid for some students to go to school, and we've had some successes and we've had some failures. But one of our biggest successes is a student who's graduated from medical school in Ghana, in Tamale, and is now living in England on some kind of scholarship. So it's nice to have those kind of successes and feel like, I'm in a position where I can help other people, give them a leg up.
It's interesting that you mentioned that and I hadn't made this connection before. I didn't know about what you had done in Ghana is that we published a book towards the end of last year called My Life After Death by Elizabeth Patterson. And she is in Ghana. She lives in Ghana, and she started an education foundation for young girls. And they've helped put 100 girls, not only through high school, but through university. And she herself had come to the U.S. and studied at, I think it was UPenn.
Where is she? Is she from Ghana originally?
She's from Ghana originally. She came here for college. She went back, started this foundation, and part of her story. And there is a podcast episode, if you look at the Munn Avenue Muse.com, with Elizabeth Patterson, who has quite an amazing story. And the reason it's My Life After Death is she almost died in a car accident as a high school student, and is paralyzed on one side of her body. But she went on to get married, have 2 children, start this education foundation. It's quite a story. And I know you like good memoirs, so I recommend that one to you.
I'm very interested. My wife and I now participate in something called the Wells Mountain Initiative. And this was started, it's 2 people here from Vermont, Tom and Carol Wells, and their daughter Jordan went to Ghana with this high school trip the year after we went. And she was so taken with it that she came back and told her parents, we have to do something. So they started up this Wells Mountain Initiative. And they now, I don't know how much money is involved, but they get a lot of donations. And then they get a lot of applications, most from the third world, well, what you used to call the third world, the developing world. And I don't know how many a year they receive, and then they have to be read. My wife is one of the readers, and that's how we met our friend Salih. She was reading his application, and she said to Carol Wells, if you don't fund this guy, let me know. I might fund him myself, which she did. And he's now a very good friend of ours. He's actually visited here in Vermont, and we FaceTime with him occasionally, and we're very happy for his success. So
good for you.
That's one of the things, that you can do.
That's a legacy in itself,
Yes,
Robert.
yes.
So let me ask you this: even though you were facing health issues and other issues. You said something to me about working on another book. Is that true?
Well, people have, I spent 40 years in the restaurant business from, I graduated in 71, actually worked in a restaurant before I went to school briefly, um, until 2013. And many people have said, well, how much did you write about the restaurant business in your memoir? I said, well, a little bit. They said, did you write more? So I think, that's a separate book. There's lots of stories to tell there and lots of, again, successes and failures, but that's a completely separate book. And then I have my motorcycle life, which started very early with my father when I was 8 or 9 and went through quite a lapse for a while, but especially after he died riding a motorcycle. But then in 1966, I bought my first motorcycle, which was only 7 years after he had died. But I can't explain it. I talk to some people about motorcycles and they go, "Oh, you mean those suicide machines?" I said, "Well, some people have that opinion, but for me, riding a motorcycle, there's nothing else like it." You know, I think I mentioned it in the book here. The only other thing I can imagine that's akin to it is galloping on a horse at full speed. I mean, you're in the environment, you smell everything, you feel everything, and obviously, if you get tangled up, especially with a car or some other vehicle, you're going to come out on the short end of the story. But and I've had some injuries, not with cars, um, and I've survived them all, and my riding days are pretty much over. But so there's a book there. There's a book about the restaurant business, and then the 30 years since I married my wife in 1995. I mean, the amount of adventures and travels and stories we've had could easily fill another volume.
Well, I love that you're not only looking backward, but you're looking forward. So I mean, I think that's quite wonderful. So if I didn't mention it before, Robert's book is a horse-drawn sicklebar cutter. It's available on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. Your local bookstores can order a copy.
It's
Um,
also on, I learned about a new site recently, Charlie. I don't know if you know about it. Uh, bookshop.org,
yeah, I
which is,
it's a site I recommend because
yeah,
they give a little piece of their business to the local bookstores.
yes,
And
that's what I've heard.
we love to support independent bookstores. In
Yes,
fact, I
it's
think
very important.
your local bookstore owner gave me a call and gave me an earful about Amazon. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
I
well, I
think
have a good friend here who's a published author. His name is Bill Schubart. He's a very successful entrepreneur and used to be on the board of directors at UVM Hospital and has a long history. And he was a musician way back when, also a motorcycle rider. And he said, if you tell local bookstores that your book is only available in Amazon, they won't buy it because they're in competition with Amazon. And one of the things he told me was uh, some bookstores have complained to him that people go into a bookstore with their cell phone and they use it as a browsing platform and then they buy their book online.
yeah. No,
And
I'm sorry
yeah,
to hear that too. That's why
yeah,
we publish at Munn Avenue Press. We publish all our books not only on Amazon but through Ingram that distributes
yes,
to Barnes and Noble, your
yeah,
local
yeah,
bookstores, libraries buy from Ingram, and we found that publishing this way too, your book's available in over 100 countries. So
yeah.
like I was on, one of our authors is in the Netherlands, and he said, well, Amazon's not the biggest seller of books in the Netherlands. I said, well, who is? And he said, oh, it's a site called bol.com, BOL.com. So I go on bol.com and all my books are there, all our authors' books are there. Another one in Germany, it's thalia.com, and all our books are there. In Denmark, it's saxo.com, and all our books, and your book, Robert, is there.
Great.
So, yeah, when we publish books, I think every decision that we make, because, I've written and published 6 books myself, I always ask myself, would I do this for my own book? And if I would do this for my own book, then that's what I'm going to do for
Mhm.
our authors. Well, Robert, this has been a really fascinating conversation. And I think if you're listening, you can tell how interesting and amazing Robert's life has been. So I recommend you pick up a copy of a horse-drawn sicklebar cutter on Amazon or barnesandnoble.com or bookshop.org, or drop in your local bookstore and ask them if they can order it for you, because we like to support your local bookstores.
I followed your advice about selling my own books myself. And of course, I make more money if I sell them myself because nobody's taking a commission. Um, and I went on Saturday in Bristol, Vermont. They have what they call the Harvest Fest on the square. And I have a very small setup, a little table and a chair and a few books and a poster 2 feet by foot and a half. And I sold a dozen books, but I really love talking to people. A
I
lot of
have
people.
the same experience, and it's funny because on Saturday I did the exact same thing. We had a harvest festival, and I'm in a writers group, so four of us set up
Mhm.
together. We had a double booth, and I sold a bunch of books, and I do it about a half a dozen times a year. I find it really interesting to talk to readers, and uh, one of the most gratifying things is to have a reader come up to me and say, "I've read all your books. I loved them. Where's the next one?" Which inspires me to keep writing.
Yeah.
I had one on Saturday. She read all four of my not so dead thrillers, and so she bought my book of short stories. So I had something else to
Uh,
offer her. But yeah. So Robert, thank you so much for
Thank
both
you.
being a friend and an author, and I hope we can work on your next book together.
I hope so too, Charlie. How long have you been a publisher?
Well, it's Munn Avenue Press is officially 5 years old. So,
Uh,
but it's been quite a journey. In the last 2 years, we've worked with over 100 authors in 11 countries, and it's been growing. And I have a group of 14 wonderful people working with me. I mean, you've talked
wow.
to Lily and met Lily, but there's a
Yeah.
whole group of designers and editors behind her that do this wonderful work. So we have to sign off for now.
Okay.
I hope you will tune in to our future episodes. And today it was Robert Merrick Fuller reflecting on his memoir, A Horse-Drawn Sicklebar Cutter, a book that captures the cadence of a bygone era with warmth, wit, and wonder. So if you enjoyed this conversation, I encourage you to pick up a copy and take your own walk down those country roads. As always, we're grateful for our listeners here at the Munn Avenue Muse. If you're an author, writer, or curious reader, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with a friend who loves memoir as much as we do. And if you have a book in mind or an audio book and want some help making it happen, contact me at the Munn, M-U-N-N, avenuepress.com. Thanks again, Robert, for being here.
Thank you, Charlie.